One of the ways to think about responsibility is that responsibility is my response ability. So you're responsible for the things that you are able to respond to. There's lots of things that we're not able to respond to, and we get anxious because we feel that we need to respond to something that we can't actually do anything about. Anxiety comes when we have an overextended sense of responsibility, when we take responsibility for things that we don't have control over.
Welcome to this week's Calling a City to Life, a podcast by Queen's Park Baptist Church in sunny Glasgow, but not just in sunny Glasgow, also, and apparently he's in some sort of super yacht from what I heard, but, you know, sunny Isla, apparently he's big-wigging with the gazillionaires of Google.
Oh yeah,
it's on their super yacht.
It's all happening here, Richard. Absolutely. So we're on a week's holiday in Islay, and I've got a good view of the bay. And from time to time, various ships come in. And this morning we have, I think it is a ship owned by one of the Google billionaires that's sitting in front. But the joy of all of this is it costs us nothing hardly to come here. And it's obviously cost this guy about $4.5 billion to be just about half a mile away from me.
If he might see the really sunny day in Ireland and think it's like this all the time, you might all be bought out by the afternoon.
No, it's been bought out by other people who are almost equally wealthy. But let's not get into local politics.
Yes, I can imagine. I'll tell you a long story about Gia one day.
Oh yeah.
But anyway, there we go.
Yeah.
So anyway, let's move on.
Just to add in, if people want to know, it's being bought out by Louis Vuitton. That's the controversial piece.
Really? Is that right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. A lot of the distilleries and property here being bought by Louis Vuitton.
Really? I did not know that. So, Iain, you're in sunny Islay. Are you there? Is holiday almost over?
No, I think we still got the weekend to go. Back on Monday. Looking like a good weekend, but we've done quite a lot of activities, and so it's probably chilling out for the weekend a little bit.
You do look like you've got the sun.
I actually got totally burnt on a kayak.
Yeah.
That's normally Brodie's job.
So I was like that red beacon. So I think people were thinking I was a channel marker for the harbour because I was so glowing.
You weren't just like seeing Prince Charles's new portrait and going, yeah, I can do that just by being in the sunshine. And
yeah, something like that.
In Islay, look totally red. Anyway, Brodie, how's the sunshine? You're not in Leith, but how's the sunshine in Queen's Park?
Sunshine in Queen's Park is sunny.
And have you avoided sunburn so far?
I have. Yeah.
Good stuff. And Jack, well, I know how sunny it is because we're sitting in the same place.
Yeah, the sunshine is wonderful.
Yes, I've been away and there hasn't been quite as much sunshine. Praise the Lord that I've been away.
Oh, sorry, no, that it's sunny.
Yes, anyway, we're back reunited in the sunshine in Scotland, so thank you all very much for joining us this week. We're looking at the rather straightforward and simple topic of Melchizedek this week. So Iain, why don't you give us a summary of what you spoke about, and then we're going to completely ignore that summary and ask some really complicated questions. Basically, did Melchizedek write Hebrews? That's where I'm starting. But give us a summary to begin with.
It sounds like just another normal week on the podcast, Richard. So we were in Hebrews 7, though we didn't really get into the depths of it. I really picked up the moment that this all kicks off in Genesis 14 and looked at Abraham's encounter with this strange Melchizedek character, who in many ways becomes a kind of prophetic preview of how God's salvation would look when it arrives on planet Earth. And we have the sacrificial system and so on that flows on through the Levitical line post Melchizedek. But Melchizedek kind of stands alone as a particular character that manifests how God works. So we just looked at the significance of God being at work over a long period of time and the significance of this moment when Melchizedek appears.
So first question or first observation, as I understand it, Genesis 14, it's the first use of the word priest in the Old Testament. We've got kings, we've had kings, but this is the first time anyone's been referred to as a priest, is in Genesis 14. And then suddenly dropping into Hebrews, we've not heard about Melchizedek in the whole of the New Testament. Now, obviously, this is from our point of view reading the New Testament, that the individual churches are obviously just reading the letters that are sent to them. What do you think the Hebrews or the recipients of this letter thought when, they're reading along or they're having it read out to them? Chapter 1 we get, 2, 3, 4, okay, we're not going to drift, blah, 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 blah. And then somebody mentions Melchizedek in their equivalent of chapter 7. Do they have an instant memory of what on earth is being read out to them? Is Melchizedek so significant, despite only being mentioned 2 or 3 times, that they go, oh yes, we know? Or are they scraping around going, where's our concordance? Where's BibleGateway.com that I can look this up?
Yeah, well, Brodie may well have that opened up on his computer this morning. I was kind of without facility, just as Melchizedek was without any history or progeny or future. I'm without any resources today, but Brodie may be able to pull some things up. But my understanding was that the character Melchizedek was known and was discussed within Judaism at the time. So I think this is just a way of trying to say how do Jews relate to their religious heritage and what significance has that for them as Christians. And so it's taking, and the whole of Hebrews is doing this, taking the Old Testament understanding of what sacrifice was doing and really then turning that on Christ and saying that Jesus is the fulfillment of all these sacrificial practices. So it's really trying to tie together what a lot of these people would already have understood and showing that is fulfilled in Christ. So it's not, as I understand it, something that's completely new and novel to them, but it's really trying to interpret what they already knew in the light of Christ and what he come to do. And then also adding the significance of this is God's plan and this is what God was at work doing over all these centuries, really prefiguring the Messiah coming. So, I think there's an internal conversation here that we are observing as people who don't really have that same heritage.
So when they hear the phrase "order of Melchizedek," Brodie, what do the hearers of Hebrews think that means?
So Iain's right. I mean, all that I would be able to add to what Iain has said is where specifically some of these extant sources are. And I think Hebrews, the commentators say that Hebrews is early with regards to some of this other chat about Melchizedek that is going on, but it would appear that at the time that Hebrews is being written, there are conversations going on in Jewish circles and Christian circles about Melchizedek. So the community and quorum, the Essenes, some of their writings mention Melchizedek. The Nag Hammadi library mentions them. Josephus mentions them, the Jewish historian. They come to different conclusions about him. And the whole thing about the order of Melchizedek. So if you remember, one of the basic rules of thumb of what is happening in the book of Hebrews. And the book of Hebrews is a series of comparisons of the old and the new, of the superiority of Jesus to everything else. So you have all these comparisons. And the whole order of Melchizedek thing is this, that he is specifically chosen by God and doesn't depend on some kind of ancestral lineage. So in the Old Testament, once the priestly system gets up and going, you needed to be a Levite to be a priest. So if you were born a Levite, you're a priest. And that meant that, because we all know that while in one sense children are like their parents, in another sense it can all go very wrong. So you end up with some really bad priests who are priests for no other reason than their heritage. and they were terrible. Whereas Melchizedek, the inference is he is chosen by God and he is a priest forever. And the emphasis that the writer here is going to make is on the election of Jesus by God, or the choosing of Jesus by God, and that he is a priest forever. Therefore, his priestly status and what he's able to do as a priest is just so superior to anything that has gone before. And that's also, I don't think there's kind of like, it's not like the Order of the Garter or all these other silly, nonsensy kind of things that we have in our hereditary system. It's you couldn't join. I don't think there was a bunch of folk wandering around the Middle East who kind of like wore special badges or robes or funny hats or anything and called themselves the Order of Melchizedek. There's no suggestion that that's what's happening. It's really referring, the Order of Melchizedek really refers to this, that he's chosen by God, that he is superior. And that's a whole bit about the tithe of showing that Melchizedek, Abraham recognizes Melchizedek's superiority. And therefore, Jesus is the most supreme priest of all.
So is this coming out of questionings, or is this likely to be coming out of questionings for the fact that Jesus was not of the order of the Levites, and there was some questioning, well, how can this guy be represented because he's not from the line of priests? So they're going, oh, wait a minute, it doesn't matter that he's not from that line because he's from this other thing, which the Jews understood as being kind of not coming from nowhere, but not coming, as you say, from a hereditary. It was just, here was a thing that stands alone, a unique example, and this is our other unique example.
So I think that's part of it. And then as we go further on in Hebrews, he's going to dive a bit more into kind of like the sacrificial system. So there's an obvious question as to, why are we not sacrificing animals like we did before? I wonder if that's playing on in the background. We've not got that far enough. I've not read enough around where we're going with that. But I wonder whether that's also in the background. And obviously, we're going to come to because of the sacrifice of Jesus, there is no need for any other sacrifice.
I suppose just playing into that is this whole conversation that's going on throughout the whole New Testament, which is how Jewish are Christians and how much of what has been expressed and lived out in the Old Testament is required to actually carry on. So are Christians just a little bit of a community within Judaism who have a few quirky ideas, or is this something that supersedes Judaism and that Christ is the Messiah and therefore really reinterprets the whole of what people have learned as Jewish people? And so that conversation's happening, and if Jesus is superior, which is the whole kind of Hebrews theme, as Brodie's been saying, if he is superior, then what does that mean for everything else? Where does everything else fit in? Does it fit in? And it's without kind of making it just an example, but I think for all of us, we have to kind of work out how much of our own culture and heritage do we bring into our faith in Christ, and where does that sit, and how does Christ's authority, superiority over our own heritage, our own understanding, our own maybe scientific mindset or whatever it is, how is that reinterpreted in Christ? So whilst it seems very obscure to us, there's also a bit where there's quite a practical application for what we do as we bring the authority of Christ, the Lordship of Christ, into our own cultures.
You've both kind of already alluded to some of this, but it's worth mentioning for my head, if for no one else's. Verse 3 is talking about there's no record of his father and mother or any of his ancestors and so on. And it says he remains a priest forever, resembling the Son of God. But in contrast, Jesus' lineage is something that we do know because, from the two sides of it, but we talk about him, in the line of David and so on. So this is different from that. Why does that matter, or does it not matter at all? Because to me, it doesn't feel, because it's saying that it's resembling the Son of God, but to me, that feels different from the Son of God.
He's being selective in what he is saying to emphasize the point. So he's ignoring kind of like, because, the gospel writers, Matthew and Luke, both use the genealogy of Jesus, and part of the strategy, for want of a better phrase, but it's a strategy, I think, a Holy Spirit guided and inspired strategy, is to help make a point. Here, the writer is ignoring Jesus' natural lineage and comparing it to Melchizedek. And it doesn't mean that Melchizedek appeared out of nowhere in some respects. The point is, or the source that the writer is drawing upon is that we don't know this guy. It's as if he appears from nowhere. So he is, there's at various points has been people speculate, was Melchizedek like a pre-incarnate Christ? I don't think so. I think it's just the fact of he's able to use the fact that we don't know anything about this guy's genealogy. We know next to nothing about him, to make a point about Christ as a priest forever. And that's the point. We can get tied up with the whole Melchizedek, but to do that is to get tied up with the sideshow and miss the main attraction, because the main attraction here is Jesus. And it's that Jesus is a priest forever. And because he's a priest forever, then we don't have to worry about the priesthood going wrong and being corrupted. That he is, we're back to like sure and steadfast and all that sort of stuff, that we can have total confidence in Christ as our priestly representative. And priesthood works both ways. God represented us, represented God. That we can have full confidence in it because he is a priest forever, and that's the main point.
Is this another one of these moments where, and I think these moments happen all the time, so I'm not suggesting that it's a rare one, but it's a good example of the importance of us understanding the whole of our Bibles in the context of everything else, because it's such, Iain, one of your main starting points was talking about God's faithfulness and seeing the outworking of that. And when we understand our Bibles in the whole context of it being, as the Bible Project would say, the story that's leading to Jesus, that it's all setting up this leading us to Jesus, we see this faithfulness of God that happens. It's beyond our comprehension because it takes place over such a long period of time, but this kind of consistent weaving in of these little moments where we see the revelation of how he is going to redeem his people. And it speaks to me of the importance of having a better grasp of the whole story.
Yeah, I think that's entirely correct. Jackie, I think what's really quite interesting about this story is that it's mostly a hidden story, and that actually, whilst there was a lot of conversation about Melchizedek, certainly around the time the New Testament was being written, the Bible itself kind of buries the story. So the story appears, and then he completely disappears, and he pops up again in Psalm 110, and then he pops up again in Hebrews. So I think absolutely there's a story that we need to grasp, but there's also, I think this gives testimony to the fact that there's also a hidden story as well. And, for many of us, again, just applying that to our own situations, there's often things that happen in our lives and ways in which God intervenes that we don't really see the outcome of for a long time. And I think I was trying to say, there's sometimes these really key moments that seem to be nothing or seem to be completely unimportant, or, events that we could simply have missed and walked on by. And yet God takes that and uses something that seems really, really small. And then it comes back again, years and years later, because God's story is larger than what we can comprehend. So I guess, yes, absolutely, it's good to know the story. It's important to know the story. These people would have known the story. But we also have to trust that the bit of the story that we don't see, God is also at work in that piece.
We were talking a little bit before this about the Easter eggs in movies thing.
Yeah.
What's the history of that, Richard? I don't even understand. Is it an Avengers thing, or did it start before?
No, it started before then. I mean, I'm not sure how far before in the world of film, but certainly it's been popularised in the kind of Avengers thing. So, in the Spider-Man movie, where they're fighting in the foreground, if you see a billboard in the background, it's got some description of what may happen in a subsequent film, or there's a street name that's called something, not provocative is the wrong word, something that reveals something deeper for those that are really into the weeds.
And so the point being of that, it's not central to the understanding of the plot, but if you see it, it's an added extra. And is there a little bit about Melchizedek is that,
that just confuses the whole thing by saying that Melchizedek's also got something to do with Easter. That's just a complete brain melt.
Sorry.
I have to say, I nearly went down that Easter egg image when I was thinking about it, because I thought, this is just a bit like that, where something is planted in a story deliberately to be utilised much further down the line, and it does feel like that. My only reason for backing off that was I personally wasn't sure enough if I could define what this Easter egg thing was in movies, and if I couldn't define it, I wasn't sure that many people would understand what I was talking about in the first place, and it was hard enough to talk about Melchizedek without adding another complex concept.
Well,
as we've just proved.
Well, the other word for it is a MacGuffin.
Right. Yeah.
In the film world, is that Melchizedek the MacGuffin. I think that's what we'll entitle this podcast. If that's it, Melchizedek the MacGuffin. Go on, Brodie.
I think where it is like the Easter egg thing. So one of the Easter egg things, certainly in the Marvel universe, is that there'll be like a car registration plate, and the number of it refers to a comic issue that is another story.
Yeah.
And I think, to Iain's point of, we only ever see part of the story, and what the story of Melchizedek reminds us, and the Bible focuses on the story of God and the people of Israel and the patriarchs of Israel. And what the story of Melchizedek reminds us of is that God's doing stuff that we are just not aware of, that he is working out his purposes beyond what you and I see. And that's hugely exciting, I think. It also lifts, in some respects, the weight off of us of thinking it all depends on me. Many of you, dear listeners, and many of us on this thing will have, grown up singing songs about being history makers, and, we're going to see the kingdom of God as if it all depended on me going on a march for Jesus or something like that. And it's, there was nothing wrong with that. Hear me right. It is great to have that passion and drive and be passionate for God's kingdom, be passionate for seeing people come to know Jesus, for people becoming disciples. But it all doesn't just depend on me. God is at work, and there's other bits of the story of what God is doing that I am totally oblivious to. And I think that's part of, if Melchizedek plays a bit of an Easter egg, I think that's part of what it is.
It's so interesting that you went there, Brodie, because I actually wasn't there on Sunday, so I was listening via the podcast to Iain's message, and it's the thought that came to me was exactly that thing of, I have had moments where you get so hung up on the importance of the bit that you're doing for God, and what does my life look like, and what does it mean, and in the big picture, and like all these things in relation to ourselves, when in reality what God is doing in the world, of course what we do for him matters, and of course our faithfulness to him matters in that context, but there's this whole bigger thing about how he is unfolding his plans and his purposes that not that we're irrelevant to, but that we can just get far too attached to. So that's really interesting that you said that. Iain, you said, do we need to be reminded of the faithfulness of God? That was part of your first point. And I would just like to say my instant reaction to that was, yes, I do. I love when you ask a question.
It's, you should never ask such a closed question. Should you really? It should be much more of an open question, even rhetorically. But yeah, I mean, I think actually it also came in the context of just picking up some stuff around some people will know about Jonathan Haidt, who just published this book, really looking at American kids, but it's pretty global, I think, in terms of its perspective, looking at what's happened to mental health and well-being over the last 10 years. And it really struck me because, as very keen listeners of the podcast will know, I did have a phase of reading just about everything by a guy called Ed Friedman, who back in the early noughties had written this book about a culture of anxiety. And it just struck me that that book, which actually I felt was quite prophetic, now the evidence is coming through to say that actually many, many people are living in this culture of anxiety. And anxiety is caused, one of the causes is through unpredictability, not knowing what's going to happen next, not being able to manage or control our environment. And it just struck me that this whole thing about God's faithfulness really speaks into that anxiety-ridden culture, because we have something we can rely on. As you've said, it's a reminder that the picture is bigger than the picture that we live in or we paint for ourselves, and that actually God is doing stuff, and we can trust the stuff that God's doing, even if we can't see that bit of the picture. So that whole thing about faithfulness, God's faithfulness, and telling stories of God's faithfulness, I think just really speaks into that sense of anxiety that we are increasingly living with. So I just thought it was just really just interesting having dipped my toe into the statistics about mental health and anxiety, and laying that out aside, this whole thing about God at work, even when it's invisible, even when we don't see it, but also his faithfulness over time. And I think that is something, as you say, that just would be really good for us to fill our souls with, because I think it just brings a solidity and a security.
Does that anxiety also come, though, from an unhealthy sense of our own responsibility in relation to things? Sometimes, I'm not saying that we're not responsible for our lives. Please hear me, that's not what I'm saying. But I mean, in terms of that we have an unhealthy sense of the outworking of things, that we need to be doing X, Y, or Z, and if we won't, we're kind of failing in any aspect, when in reality, instead of having that sense of responsibility and needing to do, it comes back to that piece of needing to stop and have the encounter instead. The anxiety is dealt with in the encounter as opposed to, do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think one of the ways to think about responsibility is that responsibility is my responsibility. So you're responsible for the things that you are able to respond to. But, there's lots of things that we're not able to respond to, and we get anxious because we feel that we need to respond to something that we can't actually do anything about. And I think there's things that we should be concerned about, things that we should be engaged with, things that we should maybe be contributing to in different ways. But I think anxiety comes when we have an overextended sense of responsibility, when we take responsibility for things that we don't have control over, or where we see ourselves as being the sole agent of resolving something. And that's, again, back to your point, where having an awareness that God is actually doing the big stuff, and we play our part in that, is actually really, really important. And tracing God's faithfulness over the years enables you to see that God is in that bigger space.
Jackie, so I guess one of the questions, building upon what Iain said there, that we need to ask ourselves is, so what's our responsibility to God's faithfulness? How does that shape us? And because I think part of the whole anxiety thing is that literally our cognitive functionality, etc., is being rewired by the environments that we live in. And so I've not read kind of like the author that Iain was referring to. This is one of the dangers, dear listeners of podcasts, is you end up with a big book list. But Jean Twenge is a fascinating author. So she wrote a book called iGen, in which she looks at longitudinal studies. And notes, I think I'm going to get this wrong, but 2007, just the charts all started to change, and that's the birth of the iPod, the iPhone rather. and just how technology has changed. Her latest book, Generations, I've not read, but I know somebody who has and has strongly recommended it as just how the environment and technology are reshaping us. And it's not that we shouldn't use technology, but aware of its power and aware of, back to, I guess, your point, Jackie, of where is it that we are detaching ourselves from this to just spend time with God, to remind ourselves of that big story of his faithfulness, to be anchored in that and not driven by everything else that the world says that we do. I was reminded as we were talking of particularly in evangelical Christianity, we can end up with a busyness response to God's faithfulness. And yet I'm really challenged by, Paul's kind of like encouragement to the Thessalonians, make it your aim to live a quiet life. Now that's not very purpose-driven church, is it?
Next time somebody asks me to do something, I would say, I'm sorry, I'm just striving to have a quiet life.
Now, of course, we would need to dig in, and that's a different podcast of what did Paul mean by that, because I think there's a lot going on there, but we need to be grounded in God's faith.
It's interesting because when we talk about looking at faithfulness, and we're seeing the places in the Bible where we're seeing that God is being faithful to the Israelites and so on, we can sometimes remember that also in that there are people left, right and centre who are messing up continually, but yet God's plans and purposes are not thwarted. And we can have the confidence to know that in all of our mess ups and in all the ways in which we see the world messing up and in all the things that terrify us, God's plans are not hindered. And that is also, when we see his faithfulness, we also see humanity and see that he is, despite all of that. Yeah. Sorry, I'm looking for somebody to agree with me. Please tell me that's right.
I think we all agree with you, Jack.
It's the safest thing to do.
Yeah.
Iain, you talked about the whole part about brief encounters and which led you on to what we miss if we don't stop. And you also referenced something that we have been talking about, the leadership team at church has been talking about, which was a poem which is talking about fires and the need to have space between logs. Otherwise, if there's not air, then they can't ignite. And if we have too much of a good thing, then we're prevented from actually being on fire, as it were. Talk a little bit more about that whole piece about what we miss if we don't stop.
Yeah, I'll probably put a bit of context on this as well, for people just to know what the leadership gets up to. One of the things that we get up to is we've been working together on some training. So we've been learning what it means to have emotionally healthy spirituality. And again, here's another shout out for a book list, but I've been using material by Pete Scazzero, which is really, really helpful. And he's got a bunch of books that people can pick up and use. But we've been actually going through a healthy, emotionally spiritual leadership course. And so that's been pretty much every month we've had an evening when we've been going through some particular themes. And last week we were thinking about what it means to build, I guess, structure and what we call a rule of life, building a pattern of spirituality or spiritual practice into our lives. And one of the themes that we were looking at was how we create space, how do we grow the margins in those places where we can have time to encounter God and just to listen to what He's saying and being intentional about that. And just as part of that, there was Pete Scazzero had shared this really interesting poem about how to build a fire, and actually the constituent parts of a fire are not just as much firewood as you can get, just bung it all in, squeeze it all in. You need to have space for breath and for air to come, for oxygen to come to fuel the fire. And I think that spoke to a number of us, that actually we can bung so much stuff into our lives that there's no space actually for things to have the breath of God. And I think actually, just looking back on my life, I am very conscious that I'm task driven. I've got a plan to get through, and I'm leaving those spaces actually intentionally. It's something I kind of need to do, because if I don't leave them intentionally, then something else will come in and fill the space. So I think it was a real salutary reminder for all of us to be intentionally building space into our lives for those encounters with God.
Yeah, I had again stuck behind the drums, so didn't get to share it with anybody. What a shame. But they're
going to chain you to them, Richard.
Yeah,
well,
no,
he has the microphone now.
You never give the drummer the microphone. It's a rule. It's a rule for life. The fire thing, I was kind of the image I get, because on a farm we have lots of stuff. We build lots of fires, and you can build a fire really, really big so long as you leave enough space to get it started. You don't have to build the fire small and then kind of build on it as you burn it. You can't actually just build a large fire, but there needs to be space to burn it. And if you don't, then the only thing you can do is to throw an enormous amount of diesel on it in order to get it to burn. So it just got me thinking about the effort that actually we can respond really well to God when we leave space. But if we don't leave the space, then very often the only way for God to speak to us is by throwing a lot of fuel on the fire and bringing that kind of, I need your attention, kind of wake up call. So yeah,
please let it not be diesel though, because that's just.
Well, no, diesel's fine. It's petrol. Don't ever throw petrol on a fire. Diesel's okay because it doesn't explode.
Can no one make
If
any
you throw petrol on a
fires?
fire, it explodes. So don't ever use petrol for getting a fire going. But diesel, that's okay.
I think
although, do your own risk assessment, etc.
I was going to say,
Iain touched on risk assessments as part of the sermon.
Yeah.
Do your own risk assessment. This is neither financial advice nor health and safety executive advice.
And we're not saying start a fire. No, what it does, it speaks again though to me about our heightened sense of responsibility that is inaccurate, that we also carry in life, where we kind of feel like, if I don't go to X meeting, pray about these 10 points every day, if I don't, do whatever other things that we have in our head, then the kingdom of God will not come, and all of these people that I know won't become Christians, and whatever narrative you want to write. And it's the thing that we miss again about what our responsibilities are and what God's responsibilities are, and the things that we kind of end up with a skewed, unhealthy thing, which I can only imagine is an attack on what the healthy relationship of our faith should look like. Is that right, Brodie?
Yes, but. and the but is that, we keep coming back to chapter 10. When we get to chapter 10, I was going to say...
We're going to have two parts.
Don't forsake gathering together. And I think that's one of the things... I think of time as a budget. I have so much time and I need to choose what I spend my time on. And therefore, just as you would, with any kind of like budget, you think, well, what are the priorities? What are the really, really important things? And, one of the really important things are those spaces. So time with God, it's not just me bringing a shopping list or a kind of like, please fix this list, but time with God. But high up in that priority list for me as well is time with God's people. Because that is good for my soul and it's good for your soul. It's good for us as human beings, because we're not just souls; we're embodied persons. To be in each other's presence, we live. I've been thinking about hostile environments. And we live very often in an environment which is hostile to our faith. So to gather together, either as a life group or a small group, or all together as church on a Sunday, and be in a space where our focus is on encouraging each other to come before God, to examine our lives, to hear his word, to be inspired, be corrected, be challenged, be encouraged, all those things, and go together, out together, having built up, is for me a priority. So yes, we need to kind of like look at what we're doing, and we're trying to cram too much in. We need to lift off a false guilt of it all depends on me, but that's not to say that there isn't important stuff that we should be doing.
Yeah, on the whole book recommendation, and I apologise because I can't remember which one of you bought it for me for my birthday, but the book Tyranny of Merit, I think it was Iain, but it might have been Brodie. It wasn't Jack.
It was me.
Confess.
It was me.
It was Brodie. You thought it was Brodie.
So it was Brodie. So in that book, there's a whole section about how modern Protestant thought, which has all been about grace, is that the natural human instinct, once we accept that God gives us everything free of charge, is then to work really, really hard to try and justify it and kind of try and turn the whole thing back on its head. And I think we do need that kind of reset, the Control-Alt-Delete from time to time that just says, wait a minute, let's just stop for a second, back to basics, not to get all political about it, but back to basics. Remember that we're saved by grace, not of our own work, and then take it from there, rather than then kind of looking to get ahead in the world of grace by working so much harder and doing so much more for God than everybody else, which is just completely counterintuitive. I don't know whether I've summarised that well enough, Brodie. You've probably read the book and studied it and highlighted it more than I have.
Yeah, it's a good book. He's drawn on Max Weber's famous. So Max Weber, German theologian guy who I think coined the word bureaucrat. He wrote a book called about the spirit of the Protestant work ethic, and of basically kind of like a Calvinistic inspired, trying to prove that you are part of God's elect, and that's where our activity from God comes from our resting in God. So it comes from a place of grace, but Iain has more to say.
No, I was just going to say a yes and to something that Brodie had said earlier on, which, getting back to this image of constructing a fire and our spiritual fuel coming from that place rather than from this angst-ridden activity that you've been talking about. If you think about a fire, that the actual fire and the energy of the fire is spread by proximity, by one piece of burning wood being close to another. So, when we think about spiritual refreshment, it's not just about being isolated from other people and doing nothing. There is this whole piece around gathering, which I think concentrates something of God's ability to reinvigorate us. So, my kind of testimony of that would be, yes, I meet God personally on my own. It's good to have that habit, and that's important. Meeting God in groups is fine and good. But there is something that happens, something that we catch from other people by being in company with other people. So I think it is actually a really important factor in this whole process of how I'm sustained and how I step into God's faithfulness, is to be with other people who I can catch a fire from, as it were. So I think that's important. And then the other thing, just adds to kind of Richard's point about pouring diesel on flames when it's not properly constructed. I just kind of wonder if, we've kind of get into a habit, maybe as contemporary Christians, where we do feel that the pouring diesel approach becomes the pattern. So you actually are, you're actually looking for not the natural, organic move of God's Holy Spirit where we create space for that, but actually because there have been those times where we've had that needful fire that's been quite incendiary, we imagine that's the only way that God works. And so we're always looking for the place where there's a smell of diesel, because we're always looking for the place where actually it's like this kind of really powerful and explosive experience. And yet God works in all sorts of different ways. And sometimes we just maybe get hooked on a particular way of God operating and not actually being open to God outmaneuvering that previous experience and working in a very different way.
Yeah,
that's good.
To extract it even further, I wonder whether, do you think that people nowadays, the youth of today, do you think they build fires enough in the way that we do? We're using all these fire metaphors, and I'm like, when was do teenagers still build fires places?
No, because you're not allowed to. So it was fascinating conversation with Pursuit, which was MGen. None of them, I think I'm right in saying this, none of them have done the whole thing where you get a potato, wrap it in tinfoil and put it in a fire and do a baked potato. None of them have done a baked potato in the wild. So
I think, we've got a big farm down here, lots of land. I think we get the youth from the church down and we'll give them like a load of timber and some space in the field, and they have to go off and experience how you build a proper fire, and to be able to learn all the metaphors that we all seem to be using about space and closeness. If no one's actually used to even looking into a homemade self-built fire, it's not gonna communicate very well.
Yeah, I guess another metaphor for what Iain's just been describing is what I call sugar rush Christianity. Of, we all kind of like have, I certainly have done it, of you get to 2:00 in the afternoon and your energy levels dipped and you're like, I need a bit of chocolate or something like that just to boost me. And it's a false boost, isn't it? It's not healthy. And there is that challenge that we all face of getting kind of like the junk out that we can get the good in, of creating the space where we have those healthy rhythms, and we aren't going from kind of like some extreme false artificial high from which we then crash, because that's what happens after you get a sugar rush, isn't it? You crash, and that's damaging to our faith rather than building a strong, robust, resilient faith. So beware of don't throw diesel and don't throw too many sweets.
That's full of health and safety advice this week.
I was going to say, because it's not even so much that it's a false rush with sugar, because it's real. It's just that it's unsustainable.
Because
it's very effective. If you're running a half marathon or whatever, they're throwing jelly babies and whatever, and it does a job. But the thing is, the thing it's doing to your blood sugar is horrific, and then the next thing you know, you're on the floor, and so it's just It's much better to have the long, slow burn. But our analogies are going everywhere right today.
Yeah. Metaphors are not what they used to be.
Iain, your final point, for fear that we end up on every tangent of the day, your final point was about the sign of superior salvation that Melchizedek... I can't even say it now. By the way, that's an interesting point. You're saying Melchizedek, Richard, and I would say Melchizedek. It does.
You say potato and I say potato.
I feel like Brodie's turning into our Susie Dent kind of situation, like Dictionary Corner. Brodie's got access to every kind of like, well, here you are, I'll tell you the right answer.
Anybody who knows me that I'm rubbish at pronunciation, because I can't work out blends. So I am. Yeah, I need to just say it with confidence.
We'll just call him Mel. Just call him Mel from now on.
Just call him Mel. I'm now even forgetting what my question is. The point is that he is giving a preview of Jesus, and that it's the sign of superior salvation, because all the things that the Israelites were doing, they had no perfect salvation. There was nothing that was actually doing it, and that we still needed Jesus. Talk to us more about what you felt that was revealing in that passage and the value for us.
Well, I think it's really what Brodie's referred to back at early on in the podcast, which is just that Hebrews is continually wanting to remind us that Christ is better than everything that has gone before, and Christ's salvation, Christ's intercession for us, Christ's work of forgiveness and purification as a priest is of a different order, is in a different league. It is not just an extension of what has gone on in the past. A slightly better version of it is actually in a different league. So in the Old Testament, you have repetitive patterns. So sacrifices have to be repeated continually, but this is one sacrifice for all. You have a priesthood that has to produce a lineage. It has to have children in order to maintain itself. But with Christ, it's one eternal priesthood through the resurrection. So I think the contrast is between something that is fading, that is really just a prophetic picture of what could be, but is not the thing in and of itself. So it is reliant on Christ coming even for its own efficacy. And so now we're getting the real thing has come. Just look how much better it is than what we see in the Old Testament. And I think that's a takeaway for the Hebrew readers. The takeaway for us is that we have something solid, reliable, eternal, available, personal, and you go on and on and on. But in Christ, we have this amazing, superior salvation.
And going back to what we've talked about some already, which is about when we get into a works thing as opposed to grace, why is it that we have a tendency to want to exist in Old Covenant as opposed to New Covenant? Nobody knows. I'm just, my thinking then was more just that why do we keep going back to that place of feeling like we need to do something in order to have our salvation, as opposed to being able to rest in the fact that what's accomplished for us is beyond what we could ever have accomplished for ourselves.
Yeah, I just think it's a very human thing to achieve something in order to feel good about yourself. And I think it's probably more than just an Old Testament thing. I mean, I do wonder whether that sense of insecurity was even there in the Old Testament. If you had a really visible system of sacrifices and so on, people could have really felt quite secure in that. I think our insecurity comes more from our own humanity, where we feel the need to achieve and be awarded and rewarded for achievement. So I think it's quite a deeply human trait that we all face, whether we have a Jewish heritage or a Christian heritage or no heritage whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think part of our imperfection, our fallen humanness is that we are liable to excesses. So living in grace is not doing nothing. It's responding correctly. So we're back to, I liked Iain's response -ability. It's about that right response. But part of our fallen humanness is that we tend to go to excesses, and therefore get things out of kilter and out of proportion. So even thinking of well-meaningness, so our motive, our heart can be really good, but we get out of kilter. And that's why we need each other. That's why we have the Holy Spirit to kind of prompt us and nudge us and redirect us. So I think there's that part of being human is that we get out of kilter and we go to excess. And we all know, anybody that's kind of done any kind of navigation, if you veer off a little to start off with, then within kind of a very short time, you're very far from where you should have been. And I think the whole kind of works busyness, trying to make things happen in our own strength instead of relying on God is a bit like that. The motive, the heart behind it can be really good. We want to see God's kingdom come. We want to see His name glorified. We want to see people saved. But it's easy to kind of run ahead or run off course. So we need those continual correction points. We need that anchor again to go back to last week. So I think, Iain's right. It's just a very human thing in our fallen humanity.
I don't know if this question's going to come out quite right, but I'll give it a bash. When is it ever before? Why change the habit of a lifetime? I just have this wondering about the tension between seeing the big picture of what God is doing in the world, but still being confident of a God who knows us personally. Because it feels like in some of this, for me, it feels like there's a reminder of seeing God's faithfulness and the outworking of his plans on the big scale and the big story. But then the importance of knowing him, understanding the intricate parts of my daily life and how he is able to see me and love me personally. And it feels like a tension. And I'm not sure that I get the balance quite right between the two.
Yeah, I don't know if any of us do, Jackie. I think we do need to have those personal touch points. However, where we can centre ourselves in God, and I think sometimes that's not about answering the big questions in the world. It's actually just about knowing that God is present. And I think I've told the story before, but there's a guy I used to visit when we were in England, and he was in his 60s possibly, but he had a really, really intense stroke, and his whole world had actually turned upside down. And he was in a care home, didn't know his family, couldn't count to 10. And I'd go and see John, and it was like Jesus was in the room, and he couldn't actually formulate words, and he couldn't understand. Well, he kind of shrugged his shoulders as if to say, I don't understand my circumstance. I can't make sense of what's going on in the big picture. But in his difficulty, he had this real sense of God's presence. I mean, it's really hard to describe. He had a stroke, and then he spoke in tongues, and he didn't believe in speaking in tongues before he had a stroke. And that was like, but it was like when he started, it just like God entered the room, and you couldn't really put words to it. It was beyond words. It was beyond rational explanation, but it was just a sense of the sacred and of the divine, and a real realization that God was with him, and he knew that he could express that. And I think that for me has always been a picture of, we're not going to be able to rationalize the big stuff. We're not going to be able to precisely track and explain in the world. It's not even our responsibility to do that. But at the same time, at a personal level, we can have an awareness that God is with us and that God's presence is here for us. And I think that is the anchor point in it all. I think you can have an answer to the biggest question in the world and still be insecure and anxious. And you can have no answer to any questions and be totally secure. And so I think the two things, working out what's going on in the world and having an answer for it all, doesn't really provide that base and anchor point that you can have just simply by responding to God's grace, as we've been talking about.
Great stuff. Well, as we approach the end of our show, while Iain sees if he can get an invite onto Sergey Brin's yacht sitting in the bay.
It's not Sergey Brin's.
Is it not?
No, I forget this guy's name, Eric something.
Oh, right, okay.
It's come from your part of the world, actually. It's come from Troon.
Oh, right, okay, right. I'm sure the internet will have the answer. We'll put it in the show notes as to whose yacht it was.
Don't know if I can see it.
So, we're gonna, which is useful for an audio medium. Yes, we can now see out the window of Iain's gaff in Isla. Good stuff. Well, we bring the show to close, so let's get some final thoughts before we speak about what's happening this coming Sunday. So, Brodie, give us a final word.
I guess back to something said earlier on, we can get caught up in the Melchizedek, but he's there to point us towards Jesus. So it's all about Jesus and his superiority. So when you're reading it, don't get too caught up with trying to, this is not kind of like some mystery to be solved, but it's a person to behold.
Good stuff, Jack.
My final thought isn't like a holy final thought. It's more that just every time we're talking, I feel that by the time we get to Hebrews 10, we're going to have a 2-part podcast, because it seems to be like the place that we want to land. So it might take quite a lot of discussion, is all I'm thinking. Sorry.
Good stuff. Have you tossed a coin over who's got Hebrews 10 yet, Brodie? Iain? Do you know?
I'm sure we do, but I can't remember who has it.
Iain's on holiday. Don't ask such a thing.
Iain.
All right, okay.
Good stuff. Well, Iain, why don't you, as the person preacher, give us the final word?
Yeah, I think there's lots of ways we could go with this, but I think the thing that stood out for me, and possibly for a lot of people, was just this image of building a fire, and what would that look like? What would it look like to create marginal space in your routine this week, even if that's just a 5-minute space every now and then, and to be open to God coming in from sideways as he did with Abraham, and stopping and not rushing on to the next thing, but actually recognizing that God might well want to divert us from what we imagine is the most important thing.
Great stuff. So if your fire is overloaded with timber, then don't throw diesel at it. Just take it apart and rebuild it with a bit more space. Here you go. So who is on this weekend, and are you still...
Well, Ian's still away, so it better not be Ian.
Live by satellite from the Google super yacht in Isla Bay.
This has been so successful, maybe we can do it like this. He said, a bit cynically.
Brodie, you're presumably preaching this weekend, or do we have a guest?
We have a guest. So our guest is Kenny Innes, and I'll let Iain say who Kenny is.
Yeah, so amongst a number of things, Kenny is the hub host for Westminster's Theological Centre, the Glasgow hub. He also does a podcast for WTC. He's also a student at WTC. So he's going to come and speak, and he's going to, I guess, say a little bit about Westminster Theology Centre and how people can get some theological training from their own locality. Right here in the south side of Glasgow, you can get a degree in theology and study at home and study with other people. So he's going to be saying a little bit about that, as well as taking on the mighty Melchizedek.
And do you think he'll be able to tell us who wrote Hebrews?
Everybody has an opinion. Maybe we'll do a big disclosure, the big reveal at the end, who we all think it was.
Maybe we should pass out bits of paper to everybody in the church and just have a vote.
Well, yeah.
This is the theological position of Queen's Park Baptist Church is decided by poll on who wrote Hebrews. Anyway, right, well, we look forward to that, and it's going to be more Melchizedek. Are we still in chapter 7?
No, it's about a better covenant.
We're into chapter 8 and about all things better. Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you all and hear from you all, and you hear from us, and all those kind of things in a week or so's time. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye.